I asked you a question, and you better answer me right now. Don't you lie to me.
Imagine this. After months of serving far from home, you secretly return to the small town where you grew up to do only one thing: surprise your mother. You've planned it so meticulously that no one knows. No relatives, no neighbors, not even your mother. Just you and the moment you want to keep to yourself. Walking into the old diner, seeing her sitting there, and saying, "I'm home." But sometimes life doesn't give us a choice about how to return. Frank Brown stepped out of the rental car, standing before the old, flickering Riverside Diner sign, a sign reminiscent of his childhood. The early morning in Minnesota was chilly, his breath thinned in the air. He pulled his collar tighter, glancing quickly at the dusty windows where the familiar warm yellow light still shone. Everything was just as it used to be, until he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The doorbell jingled a sound that should have heralded a reunion. But instead, Frank sensed something was amiss. The silence in the cafe wasn't the quiet of an early morning. It was the silence of a room that had just been emptied of air. Forks paused mid-air. Coffee cups hung halfway to the lips. Conversation vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. Before Frank could understand what was happening, his eyes automatically scanned the room, a reflex of someone trained in environments where a moment of carelessness can be costly. He saw the exits, the placement of the tables and chairs, the camera angles, and then he saw her. An old woman lay on the checkered floor of the restaurant. Her coat was neatly buttoned, as if she were still trying to maintain her dignity despite her fallen body. One hand covered her cheek. Her cheek was bruised and red, and her eyes, those eyes, looked no one, only downwards, like someone all too familiar with swallowing humiliation in silence. Frank was speechless, because that woman was no stranger. That's his mother, Janice Brown. In an instant, Frank's plans crumbled. The secret meeting he'd arranged, the note he'd deliberately made his mother think it was an invitation to meet this morning at Riverside, the excitement he'd carried all the way home. All of it was crushed by the sight of his mother lying on the floor, trembling, struggling to get up while the entire restaurant stood frozen like statues. And standing right in front of her, a large, white man in a police uniform, his belly gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He stood there like the owner of the room, the kind of man accustomed to giving orders and never having been disobeyed. He leaned down slightly, his voice low and menacing, loud enough for the whole bar to hear. "Apologize." Janice tried to prop herself up, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something. But before she could utter a word, a sound echoed through the room, a dry, sharp, decisive slap. She didn't need to look to know what it was. It sounded like it shattered her self-respect. Janice stumbled back onto the tiled floor. A teacup on the table tilted and spilled its hot liquid, leaving a long trail. Those sitting nearby recoiled. Some turned away, some clenched their fists. But absolutely, no one stood up. Frank could clearly hear his own heartbeat. He quickened his pace, but didn't run. His eyes were fixed on the scene before him. Something inside him threatened to explode a rage capable of burning down the entire town. But at the same time, another part of him, the part tempered by years of experience, held him back, not out of fear, but because he understood, if he lost control, his mother would be the one to suffer. Frank approached and knelt beside Janice. His voice was low and strangely calm, as if he were trying to use his own composure to shield her. "Mom, are you in pain?" Janice looked up. Her eyes blinked sharply. Time seemed to stand still as she recognized the face before her. Shock overwhelmed her, then a surge of emotion, but she couldn't speak. She only nodded slightly, and tears fell silently. Frank noticed the redness on her cheek. He saw her hands tremble. He saw how everyone in the restaurant avoided their gaze, as if the truth itself were dangerous. He stood up, slowly, no rush. And when he looked up at the policeman, his eyes were no longer those of a son returning home. They were the eyes of someone who had been through the battlefield, who had seen real violence, and who understood that there are those who use power to enforce what they call law. The policeman, Sheriff Ronald Harden, scowled at Frank from head to toe with disdain, as if Frank were just an outsider who had wandered into his territory. Harden smirked. "Who are you?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He took just half a step, standing between his mother and Harden, a clear boundary. Then he asked, his voice still low and calm, "Did you just hit her?" In that moment, the entire Riverside diner held its breath. And if you've ever witnessed someone in power humiliating an innocent person while everyone else just stands by, you'll understand. This isn't just a confrontation. This is a moment when a town must decide to remain silent or to speak out. If you believe no mother deserves to be treated like that, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because what's about to happen next will turn this whole town upside down. Frank's question hung in the air like a thin but deep cut. "Did you just hit her?" Ronald Harden didn't answer immediately. He looked at Frank once more, slowly, from his dust-covered shoes to his expressionless face. Then Harden laughed, a hoarse, dry laugh, carrying the contempt of someone accustomed to not needing to explain. "She spilled tea on me," Harden said, turning halfway toward the surrounding tables as if stating an obvious fact. "Here, people learn to apologize when they cause trouble." No one spoke. Glances briefly met Frank's before quickly averted. The silence wasn't one of agreement. It was the silence of those who had learned that speaking out came at a high price. Ronald Harden knew that. He built an entire town on a foundation of fear. Over 10 years ago, when Harden was appointed sheriff, it was expected that he would bring order. But the order Harden created was not based on law, but on making people believe that the law only had value when he wanted it to. In Riverside, everyone knows which table in this restaurant belongs to Harden. Sitting at the wrong table can lead to an endless paperwork check. The grocery store owner once refused a partnership offer, and just a week later, his store was shut down for a series of fire safety violations that never existed. A black family tried to open a roadside diner, but their permits were repeatedly turned down for vague reasons until they gave up and left town. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. Harden didn't need to give direct orders. He just needed to show up. Janice Brown was one of those who tried to avoid that shadow for as long as possible. She lived quietly, paid her taxes in full, and never quarreled with anyone. But in the last 6 months, that fragile peace has begun to crumble. Pieces of paper appeared under her door. No signatures, no seals, just a few short lines. "This area is about to be redeveloped. Selling the house soon will benefit you. Don't let things get complicated." Then came the patrol cars parked outside the house at night. Their headlights would come on, shining directly into the living room, then go off. No one knocked. No one said anything, but the message was clear. Janice didn't tell her son, not because she didn't trust Frank, but because she knew where he was. She knew his world was full of risks, and she didn't want to be another burden. She chose silence, a path many in Riverside had chosen to survive. And now she lay on the floor of Riverside Diner, her cheeks swollen and red, before the man who was accustomed to no one daring to call him wrong. Harden looked down at Frank, his gaze colder. "You're an outsider," he said, his voice low and laced with warning. "This doesn't concern you." Frank didn't answer. He just glanced down at his mother one more time, her hand trembling slightly, her lips pressed together as if trying to swallow the pain, then looked straight at Harden. "She apologized," Frank said slowly. "He still hit her." Some people in the pub looked uneasy. The statement sounded simple, but in Riverside, it was a reckless act. It broke an unwritten rule. Never tell Harden directly that he was wrong. Harden narrowed his eyes. A heavy silence ensued. Then he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His breath smelled of strong coffee and old tobacco. "Are you challenging me?" Harden asked. Frank remained still, not backing away, not advancing. He understood perfectly well what was happening. This wasn't just a slap. This was a test of power, and Harden was used to this test, always ending in the same way. But this time, something was different. Frank didn't carry the fear Harden was used to seeing. No pleading, Just a terrifying calmness, the calmness of someone who had faced death many times and knew that threats only worked on those who still believed in them. Harden glanced around the pub once more. No one spoke. But in the eyes of some, there was something he didn't usually see: hesitation. Some were looking at Frank longer than necessary. Some had stopped bowing their heads. Harden turned around, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm giving you a chance," he said, his hand lightly touching his waistband, a familiar gesture, just enough to remind everyone he was carrying a gun. "Lift her up and get out of here, right now." That wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Frank didn't comply. He walked slowly, positioning himself clearly in front of his mother, his body slightly tilted, a protective posture so obvious it needed no explanation. "You should stay away from her," Frank said. Right now, in that moment, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This confrontation would not end with words. And if Harden continues to move forward, he will make the biggest mistake of his career, a mistake that the entire town of Riverside will never forget. Frank and Ronald Harden were now less than an arm's length apart. No one in the bar dared to breathe loudly. The atmosphere wasn't like a normal argument, it was more like the moment just before something irreversible happened. Ronald stared intently at Frank. His gaze was no longer one of initial disdain, but the cold, calculating look of someone weighing whether or not to crush the man before them. He was used to this kind of look, used to the idea that the person opposite would bow their head, apologize, or back down. But Frank did nothing. He stood still, shoulders relaxed, arms hanging naturally at his sides, no threatening posture, no clenched fists. But for those who had been in the military, who had witnessed real violence, it was precisely that calmness that was terrifying. Janice stirred slightly behind her son. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood him. She knew Frank when he was this quiet. It was when he was trying to keep things under control. "Frank," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't turn around, just shook his head slightly, a small, reassuring gesture. "Don't be afraid, Mom." Ronald laughed again, but this time it wasn't as confident as before. "Who do you think you are?" he asked. "A hero? Here, I am the law." Frank looked up, staring directly at Harden. "The law doesn't allow you to hit someone," he said, "especially an old woman, especially when she did nothing wrong." The words rang out clearly in the silence. They weren't harsh, not provocative, but they carried something Harden hated most: the truth being spoken in front of witnesses. Several people in the cafe began to shift their gaze. An elderly man near the window swallowed hard. A woman at the cashier's counter clutched her handkerchief. They had heard similar phrases in their heads many times, but this was the first time someone had said them aloud. Ronald sensed the change, however subtle. He took another half step forward, closing in on Frank. "You're lecturing me about the law in my own town?" he snarled. "You don't know who I am." Frank replied immediately, not raising his voice, but clear enough for everyone in the bar to hear. "I know you're the man who just hit my mother." The words fell like a heavy object. "Your mother?" Harden raised an eyebrow, then smirked. "So this is a personal matter." Frank didn't react. "No," he said. "This is about right and wrong." In that instant, Harden reached for his waistband, a small, familiar, almost unconscious movement. His hand touched the gun's grip, not withdrawing it, but enough to send a message. Some people in the bar took a deep breath. They had seen this gesture before, and they knew how it usually ended. But Frank saw it right from the moment Harden started acting. "Don't," he said. Just one word, not raising his voice, not trembling. Ronald paused for a fraction of a second, a very short fraction of a second, but enough to change the course of events. He realized something he should have realized sooner. The man before him was not intimidated by weapons. "You're making things worse," Frank continued, his voice even. "There are cameras here. There are witnesses. You should stop." The mention of the camera made Harden glance quickly up at the corner of the ceiling. His eyes darkened. For years, he'd been used to things happening in the darkness of fear. But at Riverside Diner, the fluorescent lights were too bright, and that camera showed no fear. Harden turned to look around the bar. No one said anything. But no one was looking down at the floor anymore either. Eyes began to lift. Hesitantly. Considering. As if everyone was asking themselves, if not now, then when? Harden turned to face Frank, his teeth clenched. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and menacing. "A very big mistake." Frank didn't answer immediately. He took a slow breath, then exhaled. In his mind, years of training flashed by lessons in conflict management, in knowing when to speak and when to act. He knew perfectly well. If Harden took another step forward, words wouldn't be enough. "You're the one making the mistake," Frank said. "And you still have a chance to stop." Harden looked at Frank, then at Janice behind him. His eyes flashed with anger, the anger of someone unaccustomed to being thwarted. And in that brief moment, Ronald Harden made the biggest mistake of his life. He stepped forward. And that's when things crossed the line. Ronald Harden stepped up. Just one step. But it was a step that carried with it the entire habit of abuse of power that had been cultivated over the years. The step of someone who had never been stopped, never been held accountable on the spot. He believed that with just a little closer, with just a little more pressure, the man before him would do what everyone else in Riverside had done before. Step back. But Frank didn't back down. The distance between them was now measured in breaths. Ronald was tall and broad-shouldered, his breath reeking of old cigarettes and strong coffee. He leaned down slightly, trying to overpower them with his physique and authority. "Get out of the way," Harden said, his voice low and slow, as if speaking to a stubborn child. "You don't know who you're standing in front of." Frank could feel his own heartbeat clearly. Not fast, not erratic, just steady and deep. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a threat, but this was the first time that threat had taken on the face of what was called law in his homeland. "You're standing too close to her," Frank replied. "Step back." In that moment, several people in the cafe instinctively rose and then sat back down, as if their bodies wanted to act but fear pulled them back into their seats. A young man at the back table turned his head to look at the door, considering leaving. But no one left. Something held them back. Something was happening that they knew they needed to witness. Ronald gritted his teeth. "Are you ordering me around?" he growled, his right hand unconsciously sliding toward his waistband again. Not exactly to draw his gun, just a reminder that he could. That was the moment Frank made his decision. Not out of anger. Not out of a desire for revenge, but because he realized a very clear truth. If Harden got his hands on the weapon, his mother would be in danger. Frank acted so quickly that many people didn't have time to understand what had just happened. His hand reached out, gripping Harden's wrist with a ruthless precision strong enough to paralyze, but not excessive. Ronald flinched, instinctively pulling his hand away, but to no avail. The sudden pain caused him to freeze for a split second. That one beat is enough. Frank spun around, delivering a clean blow to Harden's chest that choked him. No bones breaking, no blood, just the sensation of air being sucked out of his lungs. Before Harden could comprehend what was happening, a precise leg sweep sent him crashing to the floor. The sound of a heavy body hitting the tiled floor echoed sharply, shattering the silence that had lasted all morning. Ronald Harden, the man the whole town feared, lay on the floor of the Riverside diner, coughing violently, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to speak, tried to shout familiar commands, but only broken, powerless sounds came out. Frank stood upright, taking half a step back. His arms were open, not clenched, not in an attacking stance. Just a man standing there, breathing evenly, his eyes alert but not aggressive. "Don't get up," Frank said, his voice low and firm. "And don't try to reach for anything." Inside the bar, gasps of breath could be heard from many directions. One woman covered her mouth. Another whispered inaudibly. Someone put their hand to their chest as if their heart had just pounded too hard. Janice looked at her son, her eyes wide. She was afraid. But within that fear, there was something else, a mixture of astonishment and reassurance. Frank turned to look at his mother, for just a fleeting second, enough for her to see that he was still there, still in control. Ronald rolled over, trying to prop himself up with his hands. The pain made him groan. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. Not before the law, but before someone who no longer feared him. You just assaulted a police officer, Harden gasped, clinging to the last vestiges of strength he had left in his voice. Frank didn't answer immediately. He glanced up at the corner of the ceiling, where the camera's red light was still on. Then he looked around the cafe. The faces were looking back, no longer completely downcast. "He started the assault," Frank said. "Everyone here saw it, and for the first time, those words didn't fall into silence. Someone spoke, very softly, but clearly. "That's right." Then another voice chimed in. "I saw it too." Those words weren't spoken in unison, but they were enough for Ronald Harden to understand something terrifying. His power had just begun to crumble. And as police sirens began to blare in the distance, spreading through the familiar streets of Riverside, everyone knew this moment could never be erased. This is no longer just a matter within a restaurant, but it was the beginning of the day when the entire town would be forced to confront the truth. The sirens of the police cars blared louder and louder, piercing through the thin walls of Riverside Diner, but inside, no one moved. Time seemed to stretch, the tension so intense that even breathing felt heavy. Ronald Harden lay on the floor, one hand clutching his chest, his breathing labored. His eyes darted around the bar, no longer the eyes of a ruler, but those of someone searching for allies, something he always had. But this time, no one stepped forward. No one spoke up. No one stood by him. Frank remained standing in front of his mother. He didn't touch Ronald again. There was no need. To him, the immediate threat was under control. What mattered now wasn't strength, but what would happen next. Janice trembled as she tried to sit up. A woman from the next table who had always bowed whenever Ronald appeared, this time stood up completely. She placed her hand on Janice's shoulder, helping her to the nearest chair. It was a small gesture, but in this space, it felt like a declaration. "We are not turning our backs on you anymore." "Are you all right?" the woman asked softly. Janice nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you." Ronald watched the scene, his lips moving. "What are you doing?" he gasped. "I'm the sheriff here." An elderly man at a table near the window stood up. His hands trembled, but his voice didn't. "You're a sheriff," he said, "but you just assaulted an old woman." The whole restaurant was completely silent. Ronald opened his mouth to yell, but the pain in his chest made him cough. That image, the man who had once terrified the town, now lying gasping for breath on the floor, created a powerful shock. Many realized for the first time a simple truth they had never dared to consider. He was not untouchable. Frank looked around the bar. The looks were different now. There was still fear, but within that fear, something new had emerged, a long-suppressed anger. "He hit her," a voice called out from behind the counter. It was Elena, the girl who had worked there for 3 years. "Nobody provoked her. I was standing right there. I saw everything." Another person spoke up. She apologized. Then another person appeared. "He's been blocking the way from the start." The initial words were disjointed and hesitant, but each utterance brought a little relief to the others. It was as if each word had removed a brick from the wall of silence that had weighed them down for so long. Ronald Harden shook his head, his voice hoarse. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "You'll regret it." That threat, once so weighty, now sounds weak. Not because it has changed, but because the listener has changed. Frank took a step forward, but not toward Ronald. He turned toward the people standing around him. "I don't want anyone in trouble," he said. "I just want the truth to be told." A middle-aged man in the corner of the bar took a deep breath. "If we remain silent today," he said, "then who will tomorrow?" That question doesn't need an answer. The car horn stopped completely outside. The red and green lights began flashing through the window. The silhouettes of people in uniform appeared behind the frosted glass. Ronald Harden looked toward the door, then at the faces around him, faces that had once avoided his gaze. Now, they were looking him straight in the eye, and in that moment, he understood the cruelest truth. What he had just lost was not power, but the fear of others. The doors of Riverside Diner are open once again. The officers entered. And for the first time in years, Ronald Harden didn't walk into the room as someone in power, but as someone who had to confront his own actions. 4 officers entered Riverside Diner. The red and blue lights from the patrol car shone through the glass, casting cold streaks across the weathered walls. The atmosphere in the diner changed instantly, no longer a vague sense of fear, but the tension of a decisive moment. Leading the way was Deputy Stevens, a man in his 40s, his face weary of someone accustomed to choosing silence as a means of survival. His gaze rested on Ronald Harden lying on the floor. Then it shifted to Frank, tall, dark-skinned, standing in front of an elderly woman. Stevens paused for a moment. His professional instincts told him this story was not as simple as the reports he had heard. "What's going on here?" Stevens asked, his voice serious but lacking the usual certainty that was present when Ronald was standing upright. Ronald seized the opportunity. He propped himself up, his voice hoarse but full of rage. "He attacked me," Harden pointed at Frank. "Arrest him, now." In other situations, that order would have been sufficient. But this time, no one rushed to act. Stevens looked around the bar. Eyes were fixed on him, not pleading eyes, but expectant eyes. As if the whole room were asking him one question: would he do the right thing, or would he turn away again? Frank calmly stepped aside, his arms outstretched, palms facing outward. "I didn't resist," he said, "but he hit my mother first. There are witnesses, there's camera footage." At the mention of cameras, Stevens' eyes immediately glanced up at the corner of the ceiling. The small red light was still blinking steadily, a detail he had tried to ignore for years. "What did you all see?" Stevens turned to ask the people in the bar. A moment of silence passed. Very brief, but for Riverside, it was the longest silence in years. Then a trembling voice spoke up. "I saw," said the old man sitting near the window, slowly rising. "He hit her. For no reason." Stevens turned around. "Is anyone else here?" A woman at the cashier raised her hand. "I saw it clearly. She just brushed past his legs. He stood up and slapped her. She apologized," another person added. "But she was still beaten." The testimonies followed one another. At first, they were hesitant. Then, they became more confident. Each word was like a stone laid on the foundation of truth. Stevens felt it very clearly. The truth was unfolding right before his eyes, and he could no longer ignore it. Ronald Harden shook his head, his voice harsh. "They're lying. You know who I am." No one responded. Not a nod. Not a supportive glance. A younger officer, Deputy Davis, stepped forward, his voice calm. "Sir, we need to review the video footage." The words came down like a sharp cut. Ronald spun around to Davis. "What are you doing?" he roared. "I'm your superior." Davis didn't back down. "And I'm a police officer," he said. "My job is to uncover the truth." Stevens closed his eyes for a moment, as if making a decision he had been putting off for too long. Then he nodded. "Show me the camera footage." The cashier led them to a small corner office behind the counter. An old screen lit up. The group stood still, watching the images silent but brutally clear. Janice walked past. Her dress brushed lightly against Ronald's leg. She didn't turn. She didn't react. Ronald jumped to his feet. He advanced. He slapped her. Janice fell. The tea spilled. Ronald stood over her, pointing his finger and shouting. No provocation. No threats. No justifications. When the video ended, no one spoke for a few seconds. Stevens exhaled slowly. He looked at Ronald for the first time, not with the gaze of a subordinate, but with the gaze of a police officer looking at a suspect. Ronald stammered. That doesn't reflect the whole situation." Stevens turned to look at the people in the pub. "Is everyone willing to testify?" This time, the answer came immediately. "We will testify. I'm ready to sign." Those words rang out clearly, decisively, without a tremor. The silence had been completely broken. Stevens turned to Davis and nodded slightly. "Proceed according to procedure." Ronald Harden's eyes widened. "You can't." But he didn't finish the sentence. Because in that moment, the entire Riverside Diner understood. The most dangerous thing for an abuser is not being stronger, but when the truth is no longer hidden. And from here, there is no turning back. Stevens stood tall, his shoulders slumped by the decision he had just made. Years working under Ronald Harden had taught him not to ask too many questions, not to look too closely, and not to listen too intently. It was the way to survive in a system where everyone knew there was a problem, but no one wanted to be the first to touch it. But now, the problem was right in front of him, on the floor, in front of dozens of witnesses, in front of a camera that doesn't lie. Stevens removed the handcuffs from his belt. The sound of metal clanging together is usually very faint, but in Riverside Diner, it sounds like thunder. "Ronald Harden," Stevens said, his voice low but each word clear. "He's being held in custody for assault." Ronald snapped his head up. His face was flushed, whether from pain or rage was unclear. "What are you doing?" he yelled. "I'm the sheriff here. You have no right." "I have the right," Stevens interrupted. His voice, for the first time in years, no longer evasive. "And I have the obligation." Davis stepped up beside him, taking a supporting position. Not out of fear of Frank, but because he knew what was about to happen would change everything. He glanced at Frank briefly, his gaze a mixture of caution and respect. Frank nodded slightly, his hands still, remaining motionless. Stevens bent down and turned Ronald around. The handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a sharp click. Ronald Harden recoiled violently, as if still unable to accept the reality of what was happening. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "I have friends. I have connections. Do you think this will end here?" No one answered, because for the first time, those threats no longer carried any weight. Janice rose to her feet, supported by two people in the pub. She trembled, but she stood tall. Her gaze toward Ronald, no resentment, no defiance, only the profound weariness of someone who had endured too much. Frank walked over to his mother and placed his hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked softly. Janice nodded. "Mom can stand." Stevens turned to Frank. "You'll need to stay to give your testimony," he said, his voice much softer now. "But thank you for keeping calm." Frank simply nodded. "I just wanted to protect my mother." Davis began reading the order to remain silent to Ronald Harden. The familiar words echoed in a space already accustomed to his authority, but now they carried a completely different meaning. "From now on, anything you say can and will be used in court." Ronald smirked, but it was a twisted smile. "Do you think a video will destroy me?" he said. "You don't know who you're up against." Stevens didn't argue. He simply gestured for the officers to help Ronald to his feet. As Ronald was pulled up, his eyes darted around the bar one last time, searching for that familiar fear. But what he saw were faces staring straight back at him. "Don't bow your head. Don't shy away." As Ronald was led out, the red and green lights shone on his back, the Riverside Diner door closing behind him with a low, heavy sound like the end of a dark chapter in the town's history. Inside the cafe, no one spoke for a few seconds. Then someone let out a long sigh. A wave of relief spread through the room, as if everyone had just escaped an invisible pressure that had weighed on them for years. But this is not the end. For the first time, fear left this room, and when the fear subsides, what remains, the truth begins to flow out. The moment the Riverside Diner door closed behind Ronald Harden, the room felt as if a weight had been lifted from it. No one cheered, no applause, just a long silence, the silence of people finally allowed to breathe deeply after years of living in fear. Then the whispers began. Initially, they were very small, fragmented, like pieces of memories buried too long, cautiously searching for a way out. "He did that to my shop before," a middle-aged man said softly, his eyes fixed on the table. "He threatened a tax audit. I had to close for 3 months. "Me too," a woman's voice called out from the back of the bar. "He delayed my business license for almost a year, just because I refused to cooperate." Stories followed one another, each word like a shackles being removed. The initial hesitation was gone. Once one person spoke, the next found themselves no longer alone. Elena, the cashier, took a deep breath and spoke more clearly. "He frequently harasses customers, especially people of color. I've reported it internally twice. Nothing happened." Stevens stood nearby, listening. Each word was like a knife cutting into the self-justification he had used to keep dormant for years. I don't know. I didn't see. I wasn't involved. Now, those words no longer held true. Davis began taking notes. Names, times, details. No longer vague lamentations, they became testimonies. They carried weight. They had consequences. Frank stood beside his mother, silently. He wasn't pushing anyone. He wasn't leading. He understood that the truth only had meaning when it was spoken voluntarily. Janice sat in her chair, her cheeks still red and swollen, but her back straight. When someone mentioned the anonymous notes, she nodded. "I received them," she said softly. "Months ago, an elderly woman at a table near the window turned to her. 'I saw the patrol car parked in front of your house at night,' she said. 'I wanted to ask, but I was afraid.'" Janice took her hand. "I'm scared too," she replied. "But today, we're talking." That statement spread throughout the cafe like a warm wave. Not anger, but relief. Relief because, finally, things that were once considered dangerous to say now had a place in the open. Stevens stepped forward. "I need everyone to stay a few more minutes," he said. "We need to get the contact information. Everything that was just said is important." No one left. Something rare is happening in Riverside. People are proactively staying to do the right thing. Not for Frank, not for Janice, but for themselves, for the years lost in silence. Frank leaned down and whispered to his mother, "Mom, do you want to go home? I can." Janice shook her head. "No, I want to stay." She looked around the shop, her gaze more resolute than before. "If I leave today, someone else might leave tomorrow." Frank nodded. He understood. This wasn't just his family's day anymore. Outside, the sound of police cars faded into the distance. But inside Riverside Diner, something else was drawing near, an irreversible process. The file would be opened. The investigation would begin. Tough questions would be asked. And as the sun rose higher, shining its light through the dust-covered windows, everyone understood. Ronald Harden's career didn't end just because of a pair of handcuffs. It ended because the whole town stopped being silent. And that is just the beginning. The morning slowly turned into noon, but Riverside Diner hadn't yet returned to its usual rhythm. The tables were gradually emptying, not because people were in a hurry to leave, but because each person was invited to a corner of the diner to tell their story, for the first time, not in fear. Stevens and Davis worked quietly and patiently. No interruptions, no questioning, just listening and taking notes. What had previously been considered rumors now emerged as a complete picture, with frighteningly repetitive lines. A man wearing a baseball cap recounted being repeatedly stopped for dim taillights until he agreed to pay a quick processing fee. A young woman spoke of her brother every time he worked late. He was stopped for inspection and asked questions that never appeared in the report. A car repair shop owner mentioned shady land deals where Ronald Harden appeared as a problem-solving intermediary. None of them ever thought their stories were big enough to change anything. But when those stories are put together, they form an undeniable pattern. Frank listened in silence. He realized something that weighed heavily on his heart. What he had just witnessed was not the downfall of a man, but the exposure of a long, rotten system. Ronald Harden did not act alone. He survived because so many others had chosen to turn away. Janice sat beside her son, her thin hand resting on his arm. "I always thought I was alone," she said softly. "It turns out everyone suffers." Frank gently squeezed her hand. "But today, they're standing together." In the corner of the cafe, Stevens paused his pen for a moment. He looked up at the faces, waiting for their turn, no longer evasive, but determined. He understood that from this moment on, not just Ronald Harden was under investigation. The entire local police department would have to face the questions they had been putting off for far too long. "We're going to move the whole thing up to the county level," Stevens said, his voice serious. "And we're asking for independent action. I don't promise it will be easy, but I do promise none of the testimony given today will be buried." That statement wasn't flowery, but it was enough to make many people nod in agreement. Enough to make them believe that this time, the truth wouldn't be pushed back into the shadows. Davis brought in new papers, the official complaint. The first person to sign had a trembling hand. The second signed more quickly. The third signed with a firm stroke. Each signature was a step toward severing the bonds that had held them together for so long. Frank stood up when he saw his mother starting to get tired. "We can go home," he said softly. Janice shook her head. "Not yet. Mom wants to sign." Frank looked at her, momentarily surprised. Janice held the pen, her hand trembling slightly, then signed her name Janice Brown right below the words victim. She put the pen down, letting out a long sigh, as if she had just lifted a burden of many months. Outside, the midday sun shone down on Riverside's small street. Everything looked the same old shops, the same familiar cars. But inside that diner, something irreversible had happened. The truth has been recorded, not only in people's memories, but also in documents, in records, in systems that previously turned their backs on them. And as Frank and his mother prepared to leave the restaurant, he realized that morning's slap hadn't just ended a sheriff's career, it had forced the entire town to reflect on itself. But the story isn't over yet. Because when the light is turned on, it doesn't just shine on one person, but on everything that has been hidden for so long. Frank and Janice left Riverside Diner slowly, as if both needed time to regain their sense of belonging. The midday sun shone down on the parking lot, warmer than the morning, but not enough to erase the aftershocks of what had just happened inside. Janice walked cautiously, step by step. Frank walked close beside her, one hand ready to support her if needed. Not because she was weak, but because he understood that sometimes being strong for too long can be tiring. They stopped beside the car. Janice looked up at her son, her eyes both tender and sorrowful. "You planned this, didn't you?" she asked. Frank nodded. "I want to surprise her. I think I'll walk in, she'll smile. I'll say I'm home." Janice was silent for a few seconds. Then she smiled, but tears welled up in her eyes. "I thought something would happen," she said softly. "I just didn't think it would be this." Frank bowed his head, a fleeting feeling of guilt crossing his face. "I'm sorry I didn't know sooner." Janice placed her hand on his cheek. "No," she said. "It's not your fault. I didn't say anything because I thought I had to take responsibility myself. I didn't want you to worry when you were in danger." That statement struck Frank harder than any reproach. He had faced live bullets, life or death situations, but it was his mother's silent sacrifice that weighed most heavily on his heart. "I was scared," Janice continued, her voice trembling slightly. "There were nights when I lay there listening to the patrol cars pull up outside, wondering if I should sell the house to get some peace. I felt so small, as if the whole town was watching me, but nobody saw me." Frank squeezed her hand. "You're not small," he said. "You stood firm when so many others fell. You refused what they forced upon you. You stayed." Janice took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the road leading home. "Today, when you stood in front of me, I realized something," she said. "It wasn't because you were strong, but because you weren't afraid. And that fearlessness spread to me." Frank didn't reply. He understood. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's simply having someone by your side when the whole world turns its back. They got into the car, but didn't start the engine. Frank looked at his mother one more time. "Do you want to leave town?" he asked. "I could." Janice shook her head immediately. "No, this is Mom's home. This is where Dad built every brick. They have no right to drive Mom away out of fear." Frank smiled, for the first time since returning. "I'll stay a few more weeks," he said, "and I'll try to get a transfer closer." Janice turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "I don't need, I want to," Frank interrupted gently. "I've been away too long. It's time to come back." She nodded, tears falling again, but this time not from pain. They were tears of reassurance, something she had lacked for months. Inside Riverside Diner, testimonies continued to be recorded. Outside, the town of Riverside looked as quiet as ever. But in the small car parked outside the diner, something had completely changed. No longer a mother who endures everything alone, no longer a child who can only protect from afar. They were sitting next to each other, two people who had endured too much in silence, and for the first time, They said it all. And sometimes, that's the beginning of healing. The news spread faster than anyone anticipated. Just hours after the incident at Riverside Diner, Stephen's phone started ringing incessantly. The mayor's office called. The district attorney called. Then the local press. A short video, just a few dozen seconds, capturing the moment Janice was assaulted, appeared on social media, shared rapidly along with questions Riverside had avoided for years. What had this man done before? Why didn't anyone intervene sooner? Who protected him? The local police department received official notification. The case would be taken over by the state investigative agency to ensure independence. All records relating to Ronald Harden complaints, internal reports, land transactions were ordered to be sealed and transferred. Stevens read the document in his small office, his hands trembling slightly. He understood perfectly what it meant. Not just Ronald Harden was under investigation. It was everyone who had turned a blind eye. In Riverside, the atmosphere began to change in an unbelievable way. People who used to avoid each other now stopped to talk on the sidewalks. Conversations that were once whispered in kitchens were now being told in broad daylight. One shop put up a small sign, "We support justice." A coffee shop added a public suggestion box, something no one had dared touch before. Elena, the cashier, finished her shift late that day, but no longer feared stepping out into the parking lot. For the first time, she told her friend, "I didn't see him lurking in the shadows anymore." Complaints continued to pour in the following days, not just about the diner incident, but about issues that had dragged on for years: unjustified car stops, unwarranted delays in permits, land being forced into cheap sales. Each complaint was no longer isolated. They piled up, forming a wall of truth that no one could easily break down. Frank and Janice watched everything from afar. Frank took his mother to the doctor, and the bruise on her cheek began to fade. But some wounds aren't just on the skin, they need time and reassurance to heal. Each night, Janice slept a little more soundly, no longer startled by the sound of cars outside. One afternoon, the neighbors came over. One brought another. They brought cakes, flowers, and belated apologies. Not because they were bad people, but because they had been too afraid to do the right thing. "We should have said this sooner," one person said. Janice just smiled. "What matters is that everyone is talking now." Frank looked at the scene and understood what the army had taught him in a different way. There is no victory of one person alone. Change is only sustainable when the entire community moves forward together. At the detention center, Ronald Harden awaits his first hearing. His lawyers begin constructing familiar arguments: personal incident, misunderstanding, nervous reaction. But this time, they face dozens of witnesses, video, and a community no longer afraid. Riverside is not yet a perfect place. The years of silence have taken their toll. But one thing has changed forever: the people have learned to look power in the eye. And when the fear of loss is gone, those things that were once unspeakable now have someone to listen. Late afternoon descended upon Riverside with an unusual tranquility. The setting sun bathed the old rooftops and the streets that residents had walked with their heads bowed for years. Everything looked familiar. But the feeling was no longer the same. Frank and Janice walked slowly down the path leading to her small house. It wasn't big, nor new, but every brick bore the mark of a life, the place where Janice had raised her child alone, where Frank grew up, left, and finally returned. Janice stopped at the door, placing her hand on the doorknob. She turned to look at Frank. "Today," she said softly, "I thought I would be silent again. As usual." Frank looked at her, waiting. "But when you stood there," Janice continued, "not shouting, not threatening, just standing in front of me, I suddenly understood. It wasn't because you were a soldier. It was because you believed I deserved to be protected." Frank swallowed hard. He had never thought about it that way. To him, today's actions were instinctive. But to his mother and to the town it held a different meaning. "Mom deserves it," he said simply. "And so does everyone else." Inside the house, Janice brewed tea. Her hands still trembled slightly, but no longer from fear. They sat opposite each other in the small kitchen, bathed in warm yellow light. No more car horns, no more shouting, Just two people learning to come to terms with the truth that had just been revealed. In the days that followed, Riverside continued to change, not dramatically, not abruptly, but steadily. Ronald Harden's first hearing took place in front of more residents than ever before, not for gloating, but to ensure that this time, the matter would not be buried. Some people in the police department were suspended pending investigation. Others voluntarily offered to cooperate. The system, accustomed to operating in the shadows, was forced to adapt to the light. Frank was preparing to return to his unit, but not with the same sense of separation as before. He had applied for a transfer. He wasn't sure if it would be approved, but this time, he knew he wasn't turning his back on his homeland again. The day before he left, Janice stood on the porch, looking at her son. "Wherever you are," she said, "remember this. It's not because you were stronger than him today. It's because, finally, people have broken their silence." Frank nodded. "I'll remember." As his car disappeared down the road, Janice stood there for a long time. But she didn't feel empty, because the fear, the thing that had once occupied her heart, was gone. The slap at Riverside Diner that morning was meant to consolidate power, but it backfired. It ended the career of an abuser. It shattered the silence of a community, and it reminded everyone that justice doesn't begin with strength, but with daring to speak the truth. If this story makes you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes, what changes an entire town begins with one person who refuses to walk away.